Hi, Gary. Welcome to the Animal Tone podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Claudia.
How is this veganism kind of central? Because I know veganism is really important to your idea of abolition. So we've spoken a little bit about animal welfare, and I think we've briefly touched on animal rights. But what is abolition? So you mentioned there that abolition has to do with, was to do with slavery, to do with ending slavery, and slavery should not be allowed. What is abolition when we think about it with regards to animals? What
Well,
do you mean?
I could only go so far with Reagan because Tom believed in rights. And so he thought that if a being was a subject of a life, that is, had a psychophysical sense of identity over time, um, then you could not use that animal. You couldn't, that animal had a right to life in the same way that a human had a right to life. The problem is both Singer and Tom, both Peter and Tom saw personhood, non-human personhood, as linked to cognitive capacities beyond sentience. And I thought that was nonsense. I thought that was wrong. Um, I thought that was wrong because for lots of reasons. What difference does it make? What if an animal is sentient? Then that animal does have a connection with the future self, the self in the next second. In other words, even if the animal is not cognitively sophisticated, even if the animal can't think about what the animal is going to do on the animal sabbatical next year, um, the animal still has a sense of connection to the next second of consciousness. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, anything else is arbitrary. Anything else requires you draw completely arbitrary lines. And so, but neither Peter certainly wasn't going to go there, and Tom wasn't going to go there. And Tom still had a very sort of hierarchical notion. Like in the case for animal rights, Tom says, well, if you're on a lifeboat with a bunch of, with a bunch of dogs, you're under, and it's a question about whether or not you're going to throw the human overboard or the dog overboard. You're obligated to throw the dog overboard because humans have greater opportunities for satisfaction than dogs do. And indeed, if there are 1 million dogs, if it's a question of one human versus 1 million dogs, you have to throw the 1 million dogs overboard because death is a greater harm for the one human than it is for any of the dogs. That was Tom's view. Now, I think that was wrong. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article about that that put some strain in our relationship. One thing you learn about animal people is they don't deal well with disagreement. And so I wrote this article in a philosophy journal about saying that I thought that the idea that animals, that humans had greater opportunities for satisfaction based on species, was problematic for Tom's theory. And I wanted to shift it over to sentience. So that's, by the mid 90s, things are heating up politically very much in the States, in that the large animal groups, there was a period of time in the early to mid 90s where Tom and I were going around and talking to all these groups and sort of trying to get them to sort of get on board with vegan advocacy and getting rid of the welfare campaigns and getting rid of the single issue campaigns and blah, blah, blah. And we were getting a really great reaction. And I think that what happened was, another thing I didn't really quite call correctly was I didn't realize how much of a business. I knew it was a business, but I didn't realize how much of a business it was. And I didn't realize that people were going to get really upset about this because I was, we were messing with their business model. That basically animal groups, animal advocacy groups function by keeping the donor base as broad as possible. And so you keep the donor base as broad as possible by basically not taking any positions that anybody disagrees with. It's like, oh, Claudia, you're a vegan. Great. We love you. Give us money. Oh, Joe, you're not a vegan. That's fine. Just give us money. And so it was like, you have to keep the donor base very, very broad. And I didn't realize how people were going to respond. And it got really ugly. It got really, by the mid 90s, it got very, very ugly. And when Tom died, I wrote an essay, which there was an in memoriam issue of Between the Species. I think that's what it's called, Between the Species. It's a philosophy journal for animal topics, and they did a special issue about Tom, and I had the lead article, and I talked about how the movement fell apart in the 1990s, and anyone who's interested in the history of the movement really ought to read that article because I documented. I mean, it's fairly clear what happened. There was there was a serious reaction on the part of these large animal groups.
And is that because you were proposing no use? That the only way to
Yeah,
move forward,
yeah,
so
yeah.
like animal welfare is still kind of saying we can use animals, we just have to make the use a little bit more pleasant in our mind, whereas abolition is saying no use, we can't condone any use. And this, just like you said,
Right,
disrupted kind of the campaigning and the ideas that people were already working on.
right. And think about it this way. Um, the animal groups were sort of happily functioning with Peter Singer as their business as their business model. Peter Singer's view was anything that reduces suffering is a good idea. So, like, anything can be described as reducing suffering. So any nonsense campaign can be described as reducing suffering. So these people were able. I mean, this was a business model that couldn't fail. I mean, it was basically you could endlessly generate welfarist campaigns, which is what they were doing. And so we come along and we start saying that's all bullshit. It's got to stop. Single issue campaigns are problematic. Welfare campaigns are problematic. Single issue campaigns are problematic. We ought to be proposing veganism. We ought to be very clear about human rights. We ought not to be promoting sexism, racism, other forms of discrimination. We ought to be clear about this, that we're the peace movement. We're just including animals.